Hey, y'all.
Greetings, humans.
You're one to be speaking, Mr. CPU guy. Humans.
Hi, everyone.
Hello.
John said he would join halfway through if we're still going. I imagine we'll still be going.
Should we go ahead and get started?
I think so.
5 past. Okay. I think other folks, yeah. Thank you, Sajay, for adding stuff to the agenda. Sorry, I got kind of feisty over the weekend and opened a bunch of PRs. So go ahead and apologize ahead of time. but I guess seeing the conversations go round and round of like when and how best and by what threshold to introduce new manifests. Does it mean that the spec is frozen? I think general consensus is the spec is not and has not been frozen, but to achieve certain functionality, what's the bare minimum requirements? So that if we did introduce a new spec, is it a new manifest, it's substantially different. So then, like, if we follow that train of thought, then I was thinking, like, what are some of the topics that particularly have bubbled up to the top of like effectively doing the card trick, the sleight of hand trick of making the image manifest feel and look pretty much as generic as possible. And some of that, it was even just a little bit of discovery that things like the layers field is not, the wording was not straightforward. And it turns out that most registries even support not even having the layers field. So kind of like clearing a lot of that up in the spec. And thank you to, I don't know if they're on the call or not, but what's the person's name? Racken? You know, somebody in the community, somebody on issues have been opening issues on GitHub to clarify and like even just make a table so that we can kind of clarify what registries do and don't support, like an empty array of layers versus no layers at all and all that kind of stuff. So first on that, have people looked at 1016 and feel strongly against it? I don't think anybody's really voiced out too strong of opinion against it, more just shock that that's a pretty accurate clarification.
I'll say I don't feel strongly for it, but I'm not going to raise too much of a stink against it. It's one of those scenarios where I just worry that we're taking something away that is, for all intents and purposes, expected in early versions of the spec. It's all the documentation, like the JSON schema and whatnot, says this field will exist. The Go schema said this isn't an optional thing. This is going to be created. And so taking away, I just worry there's going to be something we're going to find later on down the road that we broke as a result of this. That's my big fear. But I
wouldn't doubt that there's some tool that, like some tool that people have almost just like imported from a library and then will iterate and they find that it breaks.
I mean, I think a lot of registries effectively do require it. That's not to say the spec.
It wasn't the case.
Oh, can you push this to GCR, ECR, Quay?
Like literally only Quay, I think, is currently broken by it. And like GCR and Docker Hub and Azure, and it was like we started going down the list, and that's why I was saying that Racken person opened an issue, and they even have started venturing into like Artifactory and some other ones. It was like it's actually pretty unanimously supports an empty array and just not even having the field.
Yeah. Do we want to be explicit about the difference or lack of difference between the field is not present and the field is present, but it's an empty list? I think we should accept both. I mean, I think we should be explicit that we accept. Sorry, that not that we accept anything, that it should be expected that those are allowed by registries and by clients.
Yeah. Check if you see that wording is not clear enough, then I can add it. I'll double check, because pretty much the old wording was unclear of like that it must have a layer at the 0th index.
Gotcha.
Rather than like the layer at the 0th index must be the base layer, but it can be empty. And the only other wording, or the only other thing that said anything about the link to the list was in the JSON schema, which clearly nobody uses because it was, whatever. But we've updated the JSON schema as well. So
yeah, I'd say my only possible concern would be that registries effectively have supported this forever. But if you're saying that even the top 3, 5, 6 registries you've tested support it, then I'm fine with it. I think it's a good step toward. That's one of the things we wanted to do when documenting artifacts, images as artifacts, is that one way to describe an artifact. The case that always comes up is like, what if I just want to annotate a thing? Just annotations, no config, no layers, no anything. And that was one of the sticking points, was that you have to push a layer and it can be empty. Well, if it doesn't have to be there, then great. I'm super for this.
So that is exactly one of those sticking points, and the other is the next topic on this list is like you have to have a config. You know, what's the bare minimum config that makes it portable? And as Sajay has pointed out, you have to have a config, but it's not very portable to have a zero length object that's pushed with that. So if you look at that pull request 1023, it outlines that, gives an example in the markdown, and even includes something in the Go bind, the Go code that you can just like, here's the most basic Scratch config object of like, basically this is saying this is a blank config.
Yeah, I'm super for this. This sounds great.
On issue 1025, where a lot of this discovery happened, GCR is one of those that did not work with empty layers.
So is GCR one of those. But
Quay actually did work as long as you actually did not specify layers. But if you had empty layers, no layers, they worked with empty layers, which is the scenario where the layers array was empty, but they didn't work if you didn't have a layers field at all.
Okay.
And GCR didn't work with either.
So you could put ECR on that list too. We don't allow that.
Of checkboxes, you mean you don't allow blank or empty, or no field?
Which one are we talking about? My audio just got restart.
Hey, Jesse, take a look at 1025. If
Yeah.
you want to actually fill in the ECR, the person who did the testing didn't have access. So
Yeah.
ECR is basically blank. If
Okay.
you want to give the answers to that, it might be useful.
Cool. Yeah, it's just that on the no layer. I'll do that. On the no layers, it's just a quick answer. ECR doesn't support no layers. That's all. I'm not saying not. Yeah, sure.
Well, that's
just
because
code.
this is almost like that. The thing about even something like this, that there's a lot of green here, and it's almost like if this was a change of like objects that were floating around the world, that we'd have to update all the objects. Like every image in the world is now incompatible. That's not the way it is. This is almost like this could be fixed in like 2 spots. ECR, GCR, and perhaps some people's bindings or whatnot. Almost. Anyhow, I feel like this kind of change is not as catastrophic as.
So far, the one column though that we're getting all the checks in is the Scratch layer, where they specify nearly empty config, just a couple brackets, and then use the same field for your layer blob. And so it's not completely empty, but it would have to be interpreted as relatively empty as per your usage of it.
You're saying is green so far green light?
The far right column is the one that's got that, and that's the one that you actually do push a layer, but the layer only has a blob with 2 bytes in it, and it's the same blob for both, and so you wouldn't have to push it twice.
Okay. Anyhow, so that's pretty much that. I think specifying, clearing up. What was the exact clearing up that you wanted to see, Jason, on the layers?
Just to finish up that one last point there, the advantage of that last option is that you don't have to do anything. The spec already says you have to have 1 layer, and this is pushing 1 layer. There's nothing to change anywhere in the spec if we go with that option.
Repeat that again. I'm sorry.
the last column there where we're saying, let's do the scratch layer, there's nothing to change in the spec anywhere if we do that because it's already specified. You still have a layers field. You still push a layer in there, but the layer is the same as the config.
For that test.
It's just 2 bytes. There's no change at all we have to approve. There's nothing we have to really do anywhere. It's just documenting it.
Is scratch layer still open brace, close brace, like the scratch config is?
He's got examples down there. So you go down to the last example and it's just the 2 braces. That's the 2 bytes.
Right.
But it's the same blob for both. And so every time you push one of these things, you're going to have that one blob out there and it will probably already be pushed that registry 90% of the time.
In that case,
it'd be with a different media type. That's what John was asking. And it makes sense why John was talking about having it be a function that takes a media type.
Yeah, like if you say it's a layer gzip, layer tar gzip, and you send an empty JSON document, like things might practically handle it, but the open brace, close brace is not a valid tar gzip.
Correct. I've had the same concern in other places where we change the artifact type to be what we're pushing. And it makes sense if I'm pushing a JSON thing to say, here's an empty config for an SPDX JSON format. But if I push an SPDX XML format and I specify my artifact type is that empty couple brackets, that's not valid XML.
I think we would say the scratch document for the config media type, the config JSON media type is open brace, close brace. If you define your own config media type of SBOM, SPDX XML, you define what you accept and what you don't accept and what scratch means. But like we want to have a special config when you specify media type, config media type of OCI config, it must be at least this scratch document.
I think one of the big reasons that we went with the open close bracket is that there are a lot of registries that are parsing the config even if they don't recognize the config media type.
Totally. I think there is a lot of common practice out in the world, and part of our job is to constrain responsibly that common practice. The genie is out of the bottle, so at some point we can't really stop them from doing whatever they want. We can say this is the place in the spec, chapter and verse, where what you're doing is not spec expected. Like if you are ignoring the config media type and parsing it as JSON, even though the config media type told you it was XML, that's on you, buddy. Not that that's cold comfort to them when they're breaking and like whatever, but we can at least say the spec says you shouldn't do that. I think we should be clear that the scratch document is for the config media type of OCI config, and the scratch layer contents are whatever we think should be these like special case scratch thing for when the layer media type is OCI layer.
If it's a scratch layer though, by the definition, I'm not a fan of the term there. I think those 2 media types will probably be the same and they're going to be like empty something or other.
Oh yeah, yeah, that's a good point. We can also say if the media type is empty, then the scratch. Yeah, I guess I see what you're saying.
It's going to be a special empty media type. It's not going to be a media type that's
literal empty.
Missing. Yeah, it's not going to be literally no value there, but it's going to be a value that says, hey, this field is empty.
Yeah, but people are going to ignore the layer media type, not see that it says it's going to be empty, try to parse it as a tar gz, explode, and be mad. I think if we are worried about that, we can make the scratch layer, when the layer media type is layer, scratch, I agree that word is weird, but empty is equally bad. When the layer media type is layer tar gz, it is an empty tar gz, which is like 38 bytes of the headers and the whatever. And we can define if the media type is empty, then it's 0 bytes. Does that make sense? Like, so we define 3 new scratch things for each of these media types.
The only thing we can't do is a size 0 layer. That's the thing that breaks a lot of places. a size 0 blob.
A size 0 blob will not be used unless you have the media type of OCI empty.
Yeah,
which
you still can't do
people
it.
should consider. And we can say, when you don't consider that, when you ignore that and try to parse it as JSON or parse it as a tar, then that's on you, buddy.
Aaron, take it.
That runs into the same problem that we have. The reason 999 is an issue, right? Is that if somebody uploads an empty to one place, we can't copy it to a registry that doesn't support it.
Yeah, it's
but
there are a lot of places that don't accept that 0 length because they're pushing it to an S3 backend, and the S3 backend doesn't accept that for its input, and so you have to push something in the blob.
I think there's an important difference there. Now, I'm going to take your point, I think, at the end of it, but there's an important difference that is that we are defining a new media type that says it's allowed to be empty, and if you are ignoring it, then that's on you. I do agree that, like, in OCI 1.1, under the new rules, empty is a special media type that we're allowed to push around, but under the old rules, it will be ignored and written and blow up. So yeah, I think you're probably right. We're still going to have this problem, though, where if the Scratch layer is open brace, close brace, anything that expects to be able to parse it as a tar will not be happy. Do we care that they're not happy? I don't know. Probably.
I mean, to be fair, that's the current way it's going to be with literally any SBOM or plain text file or whatever, if they're not paying attention to the MIME type, media type.
Yeah.
I don't see a lot of problems when we're parsing the layers. I see them when they're parsing the configs, and that's where the open brace, close brace just worked in those scenarios.
That makes sense. Yeah, go ahead, Aaron. Sorry.
If we standardize an empty media type with special behavior, it needs to be generic. So the issue is with an artifact, I care about in the referrers API, or care about with artifacts, the artifact type being projected into the referrers API or into descriptors on indexes. And a config type of a media type of empty is no information. The artifact is empty, but that's not actually true because the artifact could have blobs on it. So, like if I put an image manifest out there with an SBOM layer attached to it, but I don't want to push a config type, I want to push empty, then the artifact type projected into other APIs is empty, not SBOM.
Yeah, so my way of phrasing this that takes a second to spit out is, if I'm going to push my electron bill of materials, I keep picking on that one, or whatever I'm going to do, I'll have my electron bill of materials media type, and it's just known within my application that I don't care about the content. And so within my application, whenever I see the electron bill of materials media type, there might be a couple empty brackets in there, and that might be it. But all my tooling is processing it just doesn't even pull the blob because I'm expecting it to be empty and no value in there.
Yeah, I would say we should either designate a special case SHA, and I think there's been a couple suggestions there, or a special case behavior that you are allowed to simply reference anything in a descriptor in the config type if the length is 0. That the media type that is just, clients are just not expected to pull it because it has length 0. All of the information is already in the descriptor.
It has to be a SHA that you can push for backward compatibility, because the registry is going to validate that you've already pushed all the blobs within the manifest ahead of time. And so it has to, at least on existing registries, be something we've already pushed. And so you end up with like the double brackets. The only challenge I have with some more cases saying, hey, you can skip the checks and whatnot, is there is a different workflow for push than pull. Push, you still have to push the blob and get it up there. Pull, you can skip that. But for me, when I push, I do an initial head request. And so I now need 2 head requests. One when I'm doing a push and I want to verify it's really there. And another when I'm just saying, I don't care if it's really there, just tell me what this head request would have done if it was there. Gets a little complicated.
For the sake of the agenda, good discussion, and I think it would play in together. Do you think we should at least for 1023, does people have knee-jerk reaction to edit that, or can we possibly just leave that as it is and then figure out the scratch layers discussion as it relates to it? Like, is there anything else needed on 1023? Cricket.
The only thing I would suggest is that we change the or add an additional example with a different media type to indicate that you do not have to specify OCI image config plus JSON.
That seems reasonable.
Like what? Hold on. So you're
Like
saying
SBOM.
that we don't have, is as far as the example in the scratch config doesn't need to be the OCI image config?
Yes.
Because it might not even be a technically good.
It's not a valid config, right?
Yeah, it's not a valid OCI image config.
Yeah.
Okay,
I mean, the use
so
case
then
here is
to
probably
walk
for
that
artifacts,
back,
not
if it's basically
images.
just application/JSON is like the MIME type would be just application/JSON or whatever, or plain, like basically and him. Then in that one little section of restrictions on the config, the language around the spec of the config says that it should, it's a manifest. I'm sorry, the config value is just a descriptor with the following requirements, is that it must support at least the following media types. Would that suggestion also to say like, okay, this thing's not technically, curly, open, close curly bracket, it's not technically valid image config, so should it, I'm showing the right window, yeah. Should this wording in the spec say that it should at least support this and application JSON or some other media type that's just like empty JSON document?
It's not
application VND OCI empty JSON document.
So
it's not a list. It's anything anyone wants to push.
The confusing thing here is the blob that this descriptor points to will not in fact be, for most artifacts, the media type described in the descriptor, which is actually incompatible with OCI image layout. If I have read the spec correctly, is OCI image layout requires that there be alignment between descriptors and what the contents of the blob are. So if I say application SBOM and the blob is not an application SBOM, then it's in violation of the spec. This is, I think, goes to why sort of like artifact type was added to the artifact manifest, is that it's not describing a blob, it's describing the manifest that I'm looking at. And so config, the config descriptor is just incorrect here.
Yeah, the value of this media type, if you push an SPDX in XML format, is going to be XML/XPDX, and that won't be the content of this descriptor here, because that's going to be pushed as a layer.
But I'm talking strictly about the config.
The config media type is your artifact type.
Because that's what's projected into the referrers API as the artifact type, and potentially other APIs in the future.
So it kind of violates the definition of what a descriptor is, because it states that media type is the media type of the content.
Hey, if we're going to document a change, we can document this as an exception to that rule for this one scenario. When not thrilled about it, but
Don't love it.
The risk to implementations there, and I don't know, not having looked too deeply into registry implementations, is that you could end up with a single blob for which responses to get that blob should return different media types depending on the context of how you looked at it, right? Is that how do you store this blob in S3 or with a database backing it? Is if I either request this blob and one manifest says that this is a SBOM and one manifest says that this is a in toto annotation.
they'd have to have the same descriptor.
They would have to have the same descriptor, and we end up in a bind then for the image layout.
Sorry, they'd have to have the same digest. So if you had two different media types pointing to the same data, the data would have to have the same digest.
Yeah, that's pretty easy because we allow so many things allow unknown fields. This was the nature of the last only CVE that OCI has ever had, where you could make a manifest that looked like an image if you looked at it like an image, and an index if you looked at it like an index. And so they had all the same digest.
Yeah, that was a. Yeah.
Blame John.
I think I just pointed that out about in one of the threads about subject field. Anyhow, yep, John.
Oh, is John here?
Oh, I thought you said.
Oh, I said blame John.
Oh, blame John. Well, he's here. John, it's your fault.
Excellent.
It is.
We all blame John. We like John too.
Then he turned his camera off. Okay, so
I think I'm sufficiently
notwithstanding that hairball, I think I'll say something, either some other kind of media type and try and word it there, but
no hard-coded or predefined media type is going to be acceptable to implementations.
No hard-coded or predefined.
Because I need to be able to support Helm charts, Electron, SBOMs, whatever.
Well, I'm not saying you can't support those. It's just, I was just looking at the wording of like, you must support at least the following.
But this value is pulled up as the artifact type. So what's the value for my cat pictures?
I don't follow that.
I think I've turned into not wanting to change the config media type because it's hoisted up into artifact type. I think we can, for config, we can say there is a special config. It is open brace, close brace. It is only applied when the media type is config. If you're storing Helm charts or SBOMs or any other thing, those are in the layers of your image. And you can define whatever, and you define your media type of those layers. You define what an empty one is. You define what a real one is. That's wholly up to you. But config is open brace, close brace. The issue of what a empty layer is we could also do that for image layer, tar, GZ, whatever that media type is. I think we just need to say that it is a valid tar GZ or something. Maybe we don't. I don't know. Maybe nobody cares about that. But we can only say that applies for these media types. For your media type, an empty Helm chart may have to have these fields. For your thing, a cat picture may have to be, this type of cat or whatever.
Yeah, if it's empty, I don't care too much about what the media type is, other than that is the media type of my artifact, and I know my artifact doesn't push a layer.
For portability, it might have to push a layer.
It'll push a layer, it'll have a blob, it'll probably have the same digest as the double braces. But I as a client that's using it, if I'm the consumer of cat pictures, bad example because there will be a picture there. I just know that when I read that media type for the config, I don't even care what's in the blob because I know there are no layers there. And so I don't even process that part of it. if I'm copying from one registry to another, it just copies because the blob is there. The blob is the same digest that already got copied, or when I copy the config.
Yeah, I think that's good. Your client knows that this media type will mean ignore the layers. Don't try to parse them as anything.
That was part of the logic of, or part of the thought behind any of this is that any tools that are fetching or receiving or whatever, and even like some of the logic of like not letting somebody not push a layer to challenge that they do or don't have that object is like, here's a canonical hash. If you see that hash, I don't need to make the round trip. You don't, just agreed to not push this layer. Or
I will say is I think it's acceptable to have a canonical hash here. I think it's slightly frustrating as a client implementation to have to always on every push two things, because I'm going to have to check. I either have to get the blob to see if the registry already has it, or I have to push it.
You can do a
and then
head request, and so it is a back and forth and a couple things.
Yeah, so it adds an additional round trip to every artifact push that is unnecessary.
It should be unnecessary, but it is necessary to make registries happy.
Or just assume that the registry has it, which is not amazing. I think it's almost, well, I mean, because that was why we use the phrase scratch when talking about this, is because at some point there was an official image ID that was the scratch layer or scratch base layer image in Docker world, and then it got to be so silly that we just made it magic of like, whenever you see this image or this phrase, just assume these certain steps. So I don't have to push it, I don't have to fetch it. We can just eliminate that whole step. So effectively to do the same thing of like, you don't have to do a head request. It's built into the library of like, if you import from the specs.go or whatever OCI library, that this hash is there, you do the check, don't even worry about pushing or fetching it or head or whatever request. Okay. So I'm not real clear what else that needs.
So 1023, I think we need to loosen whatever the media type there is. In fact, it probably will not be image config in any scenarios there, because if it is, you should have content.
Mm-hmm.
And then for 1016, I think we can close it and say we're just going to go with the fact finding that said scratch was probably the most portable. And so it's close 1016, document what the method is for that scratch method.
But it's okay. I don't feel like that was the same conclusion. Scratch layers, one thing, but if it's only broken on like 2 registries, and John, since you are here now, do you have particular feelings or otherwise about 1016 that layers are technically optional? Because it seems like it was a green check mark on most implementations except for GCR, and then Jesse said that he's going to file something for it on ECR that it doesn't support empty or absent layers field.
And at least one of those two is not valid on Quay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it would be nice to make this optional, but I am sympathetic to the random registries that assume it's not optional. including GCR. How about that?
Mhm.
I'll file a bug, but like I'm fine merging this. My only issue is that like client authors or or might start pushing without a layers thing and it's going to break on some random registry. And now the advice that we gave is bad until we harass the registries. I don't know.
Mhm.
There's like a very granular sliding scale of like what things should you do to be the most possible compatible with random registries out in the universe, and this is about halfway through. I'm fine merging this, but if I don't know if this is like advice to client authors of what to do.
I think my take is the whole reason we pulled the artifact manifest out, at least temporarily, is that we can do this portably existing today without making changes, without having to force registries to do anything on their side, without breaking clients. And so to me, it feels like let's pick the most portable, most compatible for how we do it with the image. I still want to keep artifact manifest on the table for future. I don't think we know how we want to roll that out just yet. And so there's going to be some work to do later on. But the long term, I think, still makes sense to have an artifact manifest at some point. And we just need to work out how we can roll that out. And then we can get that into a future version of the spec. And so, yeah, we're pushing a couple extra blobs. It's not pretty. It's ugly. It's a lot of this portability stuff that you just have to do with the vision that in the future we'll have a better answer.
Okay. So that's good, and I'll noodle on that. Then let's move on to Real 1028.
Yeah. In responding to some of the questions on 999, I've gone ahead and made a PR to change language from ignored to accept in a number of places. And my interpretation, it seemed like there was some confusion around what ignore meant. And as I read through the spec, it seemed like there were already places where an OCI 1.0 registry must accept artifact manifests because they were set to be ignored. But I think maybe there was some confusion around what does ignored mean. So this changes the language from ignored to accept in a number of places, and additionally adds the same language to image manifest config media types, that they must accept an arbitrary media type.
Got a similar one going way back in 902. And the methodology for the madness was that I think a lot of places where it says ignored was referring to clients and runtimes. And so on that side, it does make sense to ignore. If you're a runtime, you see something you don't know what to do with, then you probably shouldn't do anything different. Just ignore it. Registries, on the other hand, when you're dealing with content addressable stores, should never modify anything. And so,
yeah, I think depending on your perspective, some language makes sense or not. And I just linked to the extensibility section of considerations.md, and the language that uses is implementations that are reading/processing manifests or image indexes must not generate an error if they encounter an unknown property. I think that's kind of what we want to say. Like, this is not an error. Like, it doesn't, I don't know, clients don't have to accept something they don't know how to process, but for a registry, like if you're not processing something, right, if you're just accepting it and storing it and then returning it later, it makes sense. But for a client, like the accept word is like, what do I do? Like, how do I accept something if I don't know what to do with it?
You don't reject it. It's not rejecting and I read the extensibility document as well, and it says unknown properties. It doesn't say unknown media types. It doesn't say unknown values.
Yeah,
John,
I'm saying crib that language for
yeah.
this.
I feel like there's a pretty big disconnect, and I think it goes to 999 is I really want the specification, and I think I've reiterated this a number of times. I really want the specification to guarantee some degree of reliability for implementations that want to target OCI as a baseline, that they can rely on OCI 1.1 or whatever as a signal for compatibility. And it seems like I'm a little frustrated because it seems like there's no interest. I suggest things like this and you say, well, it's already supported, but in fact, registries don't actually already accept this. And the majority of registries actually already accept artifacts today. So clients are already broken.
Yeah,
I guess I just don't see what we're doing.
Like, I wasn't linking that to say, oh, I disagree, we already say this. I'm saying, like, if we're looking for specific verbiage that is applicable equally to clients and registries, I think something along the lines of must not generate an error is maybe less ambiguous than accept. But I think the change is fine as is.
I do agree that must not generate an error is clearer in a place where we have been unclear before than must accept. But I also don't care that much. This is better than what we have today.
I can instead replace accept with must not generate an error.
Cool. I am excited about this change though, because this isn't the first time I remember us talking about what ignored means.
I think, ignored is applicable to like a client that is unpacking an image with layers. And I think some of the reason behind that language was that for Z standard layers, one of the ideas was to just have an image reference both the, like, just say normal layers and Z standard compressed layers. And older clients should ignore the Z standard compressed layers, but I don't think that was a good rollout strategy or something that people are actually doing. So I don't know that the current language is even useful for anyone.
The biggest risk I see is that registries do want to be able to filter and reject things. And give an example, Docker Schema 1. Which manifests with old Schema 1, registries want to say, hey, we don't want to support this anymore. It's old, it's deprecated, we want to cut it off. And so if you put everywhere in here that you can never reject if you see one of these media types, that puts them in a situation where there are different registries doing different things. And there's kind of like a common, what we all use registries for, and then there's going to be a whole lot of these long tails where people come up with registries for very, very specific scenarios that still support the specs, still support a lot of the API, but they're going to be a lot more restrictive on what they allow in there.
I agree with your general point, but for this PR in particular, it says unknown media types, and Schema 1 is a known media type, so like they would still technically be following the spec by rejecting that in some way. But point taken. I understand your concern.
There's going to be some registry out there that says we're just an OCI registry. We only want to support the OCI manifest, not any other manifest out there. And that can cause issues.
Yeah, I think the basis of this is I would like OCI conformance to require that registries don't implement allow lists. Block lists are okay, right? Like we have moved off of Docker manifest types, but if OCI conformance permits allow lists, then implementations products cannot build on OCI 1.1 because I can't use them for cat GIFs. I can't use them for Electron SBOMs. The conformance doesn't mean anything in terms of artifacts.
I'm much more tempted to say should rather than must. Just knowing that someone is going to have a registry out there that has a scenario that just doesn't follow an arbitrary artifact registry that supports everything. They're just the artifact registry for Helm images, and they don't want to support anything else.
I think they could say that they're not OCI 1.1 conformant then.
Yeah, if
They
I'm
also-
just an SBOM registry, then I'm not an OCI registry. I'm just an SBOM registry.
We have about 10 minutes. There was a discussion about the Scratch subject having a media type that is not equal to the content. John, do you have any issues with that? I just want to kind of get your thoughts on it.
Practically, I suspect registries that are trying to parse the config as JSON don't care about the media type that it's set as. But like from a purity perspective, I don't love, say, if your artifact type was not a JSON thing, then it's unfortunate that the media type doesn't match. I'm almost tempted to just say, let's add artifact type to image manifest top level, and this config media type thing we sidestep entirely. But that, I don't know. We spent enough time arguing about it. It feels a shame to suggest anything else.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'd be curious. I don't know. I hate it. I hate if media type doesn't match the content, but also like it's
the descriptor specification clearly says that the content needs to match. So either we loosen that up, or we say that for artifacts, the config media type descriptor doesn't follow this portion of this. There needs to be an exception somewhere. Again, we don't have to codify it, but at least it guarantees that this is how artifacts can be used. And yes, if you were to get artifact type in the image manifest as a first class, then, but the config is still required. So you still need a Scratch config as to define what this is that needs to go, right? So
yeah. I mean, if let's say we make artifact type top level field in image manifest, then the Scratch config can be hard coded, and we'd have to have some language around like, okay, artifact type is this top level field, but if that doesn't exist, check the config media type, because like Helm charts use that, and so there's some precedence for parsing that. I don't know.
This is where I feel like the better long term is to add the artifact manifest. You're going to go down that path. As terrible, as rough as that path is going to be when we try to figure out how to make that progression, I feel like that's a better end goal.
Yeah, I agree with you. If by artifact manifest you mean something abstract and not the current thing, we can do better, right? I'm fine with like, this is not perfect, but it works, and let's do it. Let's come up with something better to merge later, but I don't know. Does anyone have like strong opinions on this? I'm kind of 50-50 on caring about this.
I think. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say two of the big values of the artifact manifest. One, you don't have to actually push that blob for the config, and so that's one less thing in there. And then empty layers is implicit at that point. You can push no blobs if you wanted to. The other big advantage is that you're explicitly saying this isn't a container image. This isn't something any runtime should ever be looking at from the media type at the top level right there. And so there's no confusion that this is a very different thing than a container image in terms of its content.
There's another benefit, which is I think we would need a substantial rewrite of layer.md, and the language on image manifest layers field talks about things like file systems and how they have to compose into a valid file system according to layers.md, which is absolutely just not going to be the case, right? So there's needs to be substantial changes there.
I think the solution there is to just put a bit at the top like we have for config.md that says this governs when layer media type is one of the OCI layer media types. And if you create cat pictures, as your media type, it's up to you what's in there.
Yeah, so
I don't think it needs a rewrite. I mean, it probably needs a rewrite anyway, but it doesn't need a huge rewrite to get to that.
Yeah, I didn't want to slow down the layers optional PR, but if we were to standardize that layers can be anything that is not ordinal from like 0 to n, we need to call out that it can be a blob that is not following this portion of specification. So this is how the image manifest kind of morphs itself to a non-image in some way. So there are many gray areas that's still there. What I wanted to so if we have to push an empty config and we have to do a layer as well, that kind of an example manifest for what an artifact looks like would be super ugly. And to John's point of us being able to make it better, this is kind of like a bloated manifest of how it would be in some ways. So I think an optional layer is something that I would like to see as, let's get at least layers optional. And then the config media type, it's okay. I mean, it's already done, and Helm and Homebrew and all are already using it. So having a required layer also kind of like pollutes it even more. So where's the middle line? Where do we stop drawing the line is kind of the question.
I think there's a path. I won't speak for John or Jesse, who's gone, but I think there's a path to get ECR and GCR to allow an empty layers or missing layers. And then like, that's pretty great. Let's do that. I don't think we'll be able to get all clients and registries to ignore the config media, like to accept an empty or missing config, but that's a much smaller hurdle to me, or much smaller grossness.
The layers is a smaller hurdle.
Layers feels like a bigger hurdle. I don't know. They're both the same size. They're both very small in my head.
Hold on. Which one's a smaller hurdle then?
I think if I could only choose fixing one, I would rather layers to become optional, and that seems easier to manifest. LOL. Easier to make happen because GCR and ECR seem interested, at least in the abstract, in doing that.
And then we just firm up the language around that scratch config and any exceptions in that whole whatever. It's already portable, but just codifying it in a clear enough way.
Yeah. And then I think
that sounds pretty acceptable to me.
Brandon, you said something. I missed what you said.
I was saying I think we circle back to not agreeing again, sadly.
You're always doing that. Which thing do we not agree on? I said a few things.
To go to the empty layers instead of having a layer that matches the config, which is just a double bracket.
What's the benefit of that? I mean,
portability, knowing that it's going to work on ECR, GCR without having them do changes on their side. It's not going to break in clients that, there is no spec change at all if we go down that path. I
guess well, first of all, I don't think that the making layers explicitly optional is a spec change, because I think it had never been fully well specified, and VBAT's just made it explicitly optional.
Depends on where you look in the spec.
The schema was not required.
Schema was explicit. The Go definition was explicit. It was only the text of the spec that was not explicit.
Yeah.
Explicit that the field is required, but not that it's required to have a non-empty value.
The JSON schema said there must be a layer.
The JSON schema said there has to be a minimum of one layer.
But nothing about the contents of that layer. It could be empty bytes.
Yeah.
Correct.
But this is a smaller change than introducing an entirely new manifest for ECR and GCR, right?
Yeah.
But as ugly as it is to have the ugly solution for now, if we know that there's a future where artifact manifest can come into play, does that make you happy? The pain is short term.
I don't know. I mean, in the sense that okay, let's be honest here. We haven't got a prettier manifest. You got a bloody ugly manifest, right? Like it's got config, it's got layers.
Completely agree.
I think we agree. The point is, this is where we will stand today, and that's what it is. I don't see us making progress if we don't agree on codifying the artifact in some way.
I am fully there with you in saying what we're inventing here looks hideous and I don't like it, but it's the most portable thing out there and it'll get us to where we need to be the next day when we try to solve the next problem.
I'll sign off wherever you want to. Let me know where you want me to sign. Yeah, I'm done.
Victory by attrition. No. Everybody's just beaten to a pulp.
Everybody's just ready for the next meeting.
I think with 1 minute left,
we're at time.
I just want to say this process seems somewhat unhealthy in some ways, in that there are a large number of implementations that support Artifact, and we are in the 11th hour pulling it. We are undoing the work of a number of people. And now we've spent many meetings since talking about hacks to accommodate the same things that Artifact Manifest sought to implement, and the working group discussed at length, right?
So,
to config zero length layers, have it scratch blobs, like all of these things.
The phrasing I will
group
say
had discussions about these.
The phrasing I will say is that we are pulling it from this release, but it's not being pulled permanently. We're going to keep working on it and we'll get it into a future release somehow.
No, that's noted, Aaron. I think that's part of the value. Well, exhausting, but that's even part of making the argument of like, what is the middle ground here? Of like, is there a middle ground is between the breaking changes that would come from introducing the manifest manifest type versus the value of like clearly trying to work around these issues? Because even to John's point of like, there's no technical value in the artifact manifest, and now if the technical value is in seeing these conversations of like all the warts that it would take to work around, and it's like, okay, moving to an artifact manifest removes the warts. We can leave the image manifest to do exactly what it was intended to do and not have to carry forward those warts or add more warts, and then so be it. So I think that to me, that was almost part of the necessity of trying to think through that card trick.
Lucky, you want to take us
The powerful thing, being over time, the powerful thing would be to see if John actually sees any concessions in that position or that amount of like argument. So, okay, I'm gonna look at least a couple of the PRs, maybe either retract them or otherwise. I'm glad that we have that table working in 1025. So if you have a part of either fixing those or moving any part of that conversation forward of what's working everywhere, and we could I think it'd be really awesome if somebody stepped up and said they wanted to carry that into the conformance tests that Josh had gotten started. That would be amazing. But thanks everybody for joining.